morning, I was, as you pointed out, I was going to the Protestant church and feeling very uncomfortable, feeling a little judged. That was completely me. It was no one else at these Protestant. Like, I just felt completely awful, and I just couldn't. It just did not feel right, but I didn't understand why until later. And so about 3 years ago, and this literally came almost out of nowhere on Christmas Eve of 2022. Again, my story feels so ordinary sometimes, but we were having a very ordinary, my wife and I were at home. We had been watching It's a Wonderful Life. We had watched a little bit, paused it, and then it became later in the day, and I just had this urge, like this, it just overcame me that I needed to go to Mass. Not I want to go to Mass. I felt I needed to go to Mass, and that's, I believe, how I verbalized it to my wife. And so I said, I need to go to Mass tonight, Christmas Eve. And we knew we had a small parish in the town here where we live in Georgia. We looked up on the website, and they happen to have, I think, a 7 or 7:30 p.m. Mass. I want to point out two things at this point. I had not been to Mass since 1987. My wife, who grew up Protestant, had only been to a Mass one time in 1987. And so literally she had basically never been to Mass. So we go to Mass, and Keith, I walk into our small parish, and it looks so much like the parish I grew up in, which made it so much more overwhelming for me. So we decide to go to Mass, and I walk in, and it's a small parish. It looks a lot like the church that I grew up in, like I just said. I'm talking about windows, pews, but when I enter the church, there's the crucifix, which I had not experienced in so many years, and there's Joseph and Mary, and everything. And I often describe it like when you go to college, and your first several weeks at college, you go away, you don't maybe not come home for 3 or 4 weeks. At least my mom didn't want me coming home for at least 3 or 4 weeks. And then you walk into your bedroom, and I'm home. This is my bedroom. These are my things, my poster on the wall. This is my bed, my things around me. That's sort of what I felt like. I just said to myself, I'm home. I'm finally home. And it did not dawn on me until that moment what home meant for me.
This week on the show, guys, is a remarkable reversion story. There are so many stories of people who were raised Catholic. Right? You guys know these people if you are ever in an evangelical, non-denominational church. These were many of my friends in these kind of churches, guys, and they are great people. But time and again, these are people who are coming from a faith that they left when they were 17, 18, 19, or 20. And in Jeff's own experience with this kind of leaving of the Catholic faith, that's a faith that wasn't really ever necessarily embraced or lived deeply or even understood. There's all kinds of reasons why that's the case, and there's people we can blame. People, sometimes it's ourselves, but the point of the story is, in Jeff's version, here's a guy who's away from the church for 40 years, drawn back by the things that he missed, by the graces of his baptism, by the love of the Eucharist and the altar, and came storming back to the church one beautiful Christmas Eve. And this is that story, guys, of Jeff's story, and then how we can apply that story to others, how we can help others to encounter the Catholic faith in a serious and amazing way. Maybe the faith they never actually encountered for the first time in the Catholic faith of their childhood. It's an awesome story. Jeff's a great guy and a wonderful storyteller, guys. I hope you love this episode. Hey, while you're here, like this video, support the channel, guys, by subscribing. If you want to help out the work we do here, help cover equipment costs and upgrades and these costly things, guys, those links to PayPal, to Patreon are in the show notes as well, guys. And thanks for being here. And now, guys, my conversation with Jeff Lukich on coming back to the church after 40 years away, how it happened, how others can be drawn back that way, guys. It's a beautiful story. Please watch and enjoy. There we go. All right, friends, welcome back to the show. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Happy to have you guys back with us. I am joined this week by Jeff Lukich. He is a writer, endurance coach, a lifelong faith seeker, graduate of Presbyterian College in South Carolina. He spent more than 30 years in public child welfare, retiring in 2018 as the chief of staff for Georgia's Division of Family and Child Services. In 2022, his return to the Catholic faith after 40 years away became, as he says, the heartbeat of his book, The Long Way Home, a Catholic return to faith, how I found my way home, and how you can too. He lives with his wife, Mary Beth, in Georgia, and as you will see, because this book itself was a marathon, he enjoys running and marathons and cycling and even ultra marathons. This book may have been an ultra marathon, I guess. Yeah. Jeff, welcome. Anyway, thanks for being here. Welcome to the show, and hello.
Keith, it's so great to meet you. Thank you for the invite. I'm so happy we were able to connect. What an honor. Just thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm gonna quit with the running metaphors and the sports puns because it's not my forte. So I get one out of the way, and I'm done. Yeah. Jeff, I'm very happy to have you. This is the kind of when I encountered your book, I had a couple of thoughts right away. The one thought is there are so many, and I've shared this too with my good friend Matt Swaim from the Coming Home Network years ago. This was a discussion that we had because he and I've also experienced this too. We get so many emails from parents or family or friends of those who have left the Catholic Church, who have wandered away for all kinds of reasons. And the question always is, how do we bring them back? What do we do to bring back our loved ones or our spouses, our grandkids, our children, our friends? That's one piece that when I saw your book, it drew me in, because here's a story of a guy who spent a big chunk of his life away from the Catholic Church and somehow came back. Okay, so there's that, and there's also on the flip side, for those of us who are converts to the Catholic faith, who became Catholic from something else, and have friends, have family, have loved ones who didn't come with us. I had a Aaron Gonzalez on the show a couple weeks ago who had a story of, he was a Protestant pastor. He became Catholic, and 17 of his congregants, his friends, family from his church became Catholic kind of with him, like shortly after. And that was amazing. But there are so many of us who have a story nothing like that, who became Catholic and loved it, and who loved the faith, and who evangelize and live that Catholic life, and nobody else around seems that interested. So your story is also a story that interests me in that aspect as well. Like what attracts a person who's been away for so long from the Catholic Church to come back? How can we bring others back with us? How can we bring others with us on this journey in general? I think you have tons of wisdom to mine here, Jeff. So I'm happy to do that with you today. And I think that our first order of business is to hear a bit about your story, this story of somebody who came back to the Catholic Church after being away for so long. So I think we can begin there, Jeff. And I don't know where you want to begin. Take us back as far as you want to go. Tell us a bit about your faith history.
Yeah. I'd be happy to, and I should mention the podcast that you just mentioned with the 17 friends coming back. I listened to just this afternoon while I was in my car, and what an amazing story. So compared to that, my story may seem very ordinary, but my faith journey really began where a lot of Cradle Catholics' journey began. We were all raised Catholic, and I should mention, in September of this year, I found the Catholic Church in South Carolina, in Charleston, South Carolina, where I was actually baptized. My family did not attend that church. My wife and I were there on vacation, and I knew where I was baptized because when I came back to the church, I got that certificate of baptism. And so I found it. St. John's in Charleston, South Carolina is where God put his hand on me for the first time and said, "You are mine." And this was a long time ago, Keith. This was 1966, about 30 days after I was born. But it was so beautiful being there, and got a picture of me on the front steps. And I just thought about my parents, who both came down from the Pittsburgh area, Pennsylvania. And I was raised Catholic right in the low country of South Carolina. And it was wonderful. I have a lot of memories, being Catholic. And I wrote about this in my book. Being Catholic in a small town in the South felt different. There weren't a lot of Catholics. But it felt special, and it felt unique. And I knew I was, different than my Protestant friends, because I would go, and I had something to contrast that by. I would go to church with them occasionally, but But we were Catholic. On my mom's side of the family, I recently actually spoke with an uncle and found out a lot of deep Irish Catholic roots, generations of Catholics. On my father's side, he was Orthodox, ended up going to the Catholic Church whenever they married in the 60s. And, unfortunately, my parents broke up. There was a divorce, and my mom moved me and two of my brothers. I have an older brother and a younger brother to a small town not very far from Charleston in the low country of South Carolina. And it was tough for her. And so I have this memory that I like to talk about because I think it's unique. It was a couple of times I remember in the beginning, right after, my mom left my dad with us, of my older brother and I walking to Mass actually by ourselves. And my mom has since passed away, but I suspect that because of the divorce, and my mom was pregnant with my younger brother then, she was trying to sort things out with the church. But I remember at least a couple of times we moved to a house close to the Catholic Church, which was wonderful. But, eventually, Keith, we began to attend as a family, and it was, wonderful. And I was confirmed, my formation was through the 70s, and formation in the U.S., at least in my area, wasn't that strong, but I learned a lot. I learned so much in this small parish that I attended. And that was the rhythm of our lives there early on, just attending church. And my mom, really worked hard, I think, to keep that faith in our lives. And one of the greatest gifts she ever gave me was bringing me into the Catholic Church. And so it was an amazing thing, early on, especially.
Yeah. But I love those beautiful early memories like that. And the importance that you mentioned, the idea of rhythm. I think if nothing else, that you remember that rhythm. I mean, and I've had guests like yourself on the show before in the last 6.5 years of doing this that have these strong childhood memories of being Catholic. We can get into more of this, obviously, I think, as this story unwinds. But some of those core Catholic memories, those do something for you, right?
Yeah.
So I think what's encouraging for the generation who are raising kids Catholic and hoping they stay in the faith. We take heart, I guess, that at least planting those core memories, that grace of baptism, the grace of that rhythm of being Catholic in those early years, do imprint in a way, even for those who might wander away, right?
Yeah, and I'll talk about this later, but that imprint that happened to me early on, and my connection to the church, his church, and I didn't really understand sacraments then, obviously, growing up, when I was under 10 years old. I knew they were there. I knew they were important. Of course, I went through confirmation and like that in my own formation. I didn't fully understand the sacraments until I came back to the church a few years ago. But that comfort I felt being Catholic and the rhythm that my family had going to Mass, it was a very small parish. The comfort I had around other members of my church, our priest, who I remember is just a wonderful, very giving priest during those years. It was a lot of what ended up, I found out later, pulling me back to the church. And so you're exactly right, Keith. That imprint can last, and I pray for young people today that will happen, and they'll hold on to it longer than I did. Of course, that rhythm began to fade for me, as I got a little older and got into high school.
Yeah. So what happened next with that? How did that begin to unwind? This of course is, I don't want to say a classic story, but this is a story that repeats and repeats, and I think today repeats too, right? The number of families who are busy on a Sunday, busy on a Saturday night, right? And it becomes something small. I'm not saying this is your story, but it becomes something small, like, oh, there's a hockey practice this day, or there's a game this day, or there's this sport or this event here. It becomes, oh, well, this happens this Sunday. Well, then happens again the next Sunday. And it's not necessarily that that church isn't important, or there's being, it's these small things just kind of creep in, right? And it becomes less important until it's not important at all anymore, right? So how did how did that begin to unwind in your
I
life?
think you're exactly right. I heard an analogy like when you're at the beach and you're swimming out and you're wading further out in the ocean, and then you're looking outward, and then all of a sudden you turn around and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm like so far from
Yeah,
the
yeah,
shore.
yeah,
It just happens
yeah,
gradual, and that's what happened to me as I got into, high school, ninth and 10th, 11th grade. We were still attending mass pretty regularly, though it began to fade. And like my analogy, it happened so subtly and slowly. And I even noticed with my mom that faith began to slip a little bit with her. She wasn't encouraging us to go to church as much. And then in the late 70s, my older brother went off to college, so our family dynamics changed.
yeah,
And then by the time I was in 11th, especially the early part of my senior year, I was going on occasion, but definitely was not going regular. That's when that fading began to
yeah,
happen.
yeah,
And it wasn't like, my story isn't like a story of someone finding Jesus later in life. I never walked away from God, never walked away from Jesus, but I did clearly walk away from the Catholic Church, if not run. Like it felt very restraining for me. And I talk a lot about that in high school. It felt like a lot of rules, the Catholic Church to me, and it felt confining. And then, my mom, could be rigid. She raised three boys as a single parent. So I can't say I blame her. I would have done the
yeah,
same
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
So sometimes as a child, the rules of the church and the rules that my mom set, they began to blend in with each other. I had trouble kind of distinguishing the difference. But when I got old enough, I would say later years of high school, I had a little more say. And if I went to mass on Sunday, and I began to choose not to attend the way I should. And remember even having a conversation with my priest about that, like, and he told me, it's not optional, son. It's this is something that we expect. So I left for college in the fall of '84, and it was a Methodist college, so it was a Christian college, a small liberal arts school, and so was Presbyterian College, where I ended up getting my 4-year degree. And so when I left for college, that was pretty much when I left the church completely. And I think I went to mass one more time after college, and that was in '87. I went with my mom and my now wife. She was my girlfriend then. But outside of that, I left. And on campus at the Methodist college that I mentioned, the small liberal arts school, I went to chapel. I met other Christians. I never stopped feeling like I'm a Christian, and I had friends who were Christian, and we would go to chapel on campus. Some, but not very much. And I would say in college is when I really began to kind of let go, and morality began to slip. I was falling into sin. Like a lot of us when we go to college. And at that point, I had all but completely forgot about the Catholic Church. And it's a big regret that I have, but that's how it happened up until about college.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so fascinated with this idea of the rules of the Catholic Church, okay? Because I feel like a lot of the spirit of Vatican II, kind of those things that are ushered in that weren't really the intention of the Second Vatican Council, but kind of came with that. Some of the changes in how catechesis was done, some of the loosening of restrictions around the liturgy and around, right, what things the church seemed to be teaching as important. You kind of grew up in that kind of golden age of some of that loosening of the rules.
Yes.
But I think that was a response to the rules, quote unquote, feeling too rigid kind of before that, right? I kind of had this vision of this rigid Catholic Church, right? The 60s happen and the council happens, and then the response is, oh, the council like loosen these things up, and so then here are the less restrictive rules, right? And so there's such a balance in there, right? And I think as somebody who teaches teens catechesis, like one of the things I attempt to do is explain what's behind the rule, right?
Yeah.
Right, versus hear all the rules. And it's interesting that, right, how you felt on the ground experiencing that, right, in kind of a time of tumult, probably the change of how the rules were perceived. But I don't know what you think. I think that the important thing, because you're right, there are you and so many countless others before you and after you and constantly are leaving the church because of the rules, right? It
Yeah.
seems too restrictive. And that makes sense, right? We don't want to be boxed in as human beings. We want our freedom. I think the key is properly understanding those rules, the purpose of those
Yeah.
rules that are actually meant to free us from sin and to help us to live our best life, right? I think that's the key. I'm curious your perspective looking back on that experience, what you think you would have heard differently if you understood. Like, does that make
Yeah.
sense? What the rules meant?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you use the word freedom, because I talk about freedom a lot whenever I end up talking with somebody about this. But, first of all, pre-Vatican II, it was the church of my mother and my grandmother and those in my family and all the deep Catholic roots that I talked about.
Yeah.
I grew up in the church post-Vatican II in the 70s, 15 years after Vatican II, give or take. But as a child, what I tell people is, when I left the church at age 17 or 18, when I went to college, I was not mature enough or old enough to even understand my relationship with Jesus enough to walk away from the church. Yet I still did. And I did some research on, of course, why people leave the Catholic Church for a chapter in my book. And I think it's, most people leave the church between like 17 and 23, which is the age range that I left.
Yeah.
And it just shows that formation, those formation years in our Catholic faith, both like what sounds like you do with youth and what we should do at home with our kids in the family. It takes both. Those are the years where we really, really need to do a good job with that, and that will lessen the likelihood of a youth leaving. But as for the rules, I don't think I really understood what was behind them. And I'll say now, those things that made me leave the Catholic Church then are the very things that keep me here now. And it is the furthest from restrictive that I could even explain at this point. It's more freeing, now that I know what I know, being back in my Catholic faith after 3 years. It's more freeing than anything I've ever experienced in my life, and I'm talking about the church that Jesus has set up for us, the teachings of the church. All of that is just so freeing in my life, knowing what I know now.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Yeah, it really is. And your point of maturity too, I think, is so interesting, because, again, and this comes up often in dialogue with former Catholics, right, who've left the church and who are now maybe have no religion or are a Protestant Christian, evangelical, right, and maybe anti-Catholic. I've met lots of these in my travels, right? Before I became Catholic, most of the Catholics that I knew were these ex-Catholics, right, in my non-denominational church. But you make a very, very fair and I think very insightful point. Like, when you left, which is when most people leave, and when a lot of these people that I knew left, you aren't mature enough to understand what you're leaving, right? And so I think. And this is, I don't know, if there were ever a takeaway from my experience of beginning to understand the Catholic Church by reading just the catechism and reading Catholic documents and reading what the church actually says, so often we were getting our information about what the Catholics believe from these, I don't want to sound uncordial, but these immature Catholics who left the church, who didn't know what they didn't know, who whether it was their fault or their parents' fault or the priest's fault or no one's fault at all, weren't catechized to know what they should have known to believe, weren't mature enough to really ingest that and live that out. And then we all learned what the Catholic Church was from these guys, thinking that
Yeah.
they were
Yeah.
experts, right? That trope is,
Yeah.
I went to Catholic school, I'm an expert on the Catholic Church, right? Which
It's a
is
great
which
point.
is which is right? If someone says I went to Catholic school, that's actually the watchword for like, no, you don't. Whatever you say next, you don't know what you're talking about, right?
Right.
That's like
Yeah.
that's a meme, right? Because
Well, and a
but
lot
it's
of it is as Catholics, a lot of what people believe about the Catholic Church, what it actually teaches, is our
yeah,
fault. Like as you
yes,
just
yeah,
pointed out, we
yeah,
don't do
yeah,
the best job that we can, and all of that happened. That happens during those years when we're growing up Catholic and the formation that we have, and it can be poor formation or not, or somewhere in between. And I think things are so much better these days. I serve at the altar at my local parish, in assisting my priest and deacon. And that also means, managing the cup, the blood of Christ. And nothing brings me more joy than seeing our youth in our parish, which is, not a lot of youth, but come up to receive Holy Communion in the blood of Christ, in the body of Christ, and the blood of Christ. And I'm talking about people in high school and even college when they come home, and I just love it. That wasn't me, but I love it. Just makes my heart, it warms my heart to see that now. And Keith, I think it's getting better. We're seeing this year, especially more and more youth, are coming back to the church or coming to the church for the first time. But yeah.
You're absolutely right. So where did you go next in your own journey, Jeff?
Well, college was very interesting. As I pointed out, and it's in my bio, I graduated from Presbyterian College, another small liberal arts Christian school. I didn't major in anything to do with religion. I just, again, at that point, in my early 20s, I was like a lot of Gen Xers, I was ready to graduate. I'm ready to get a job. I met my now wife. We dated during college. She was raised Methodist at a very small country Methodist church. And, when we would come home and I would see her on the weekends, I would go to church with her and her parents. So I was, definitely living the college life, living in sin, but I've always felt this closeness to God. Now, it's nothing like the relationship I have with Jesus Christ now, but I began to develop this mindset of me and Jesus. You've heard about this me and Jesus mindset, where it's, church made me feel uncomfortable. But I always told myself I had this relationship with Jesus, and to some extent I did, but I wasn't, it was still largely unformed as I left college. But we married in 89, in the late 80s. We did like a lot of people in my generation. We got that job. We bought our first house and began to have our family. And, as I pointed out, my wife grew up Christian, grew up Methodist. She knew I was Catholic, but I spoke very little about my Catholic faith. Again, another regret I have is not talking more about my faith. But again, I had shut the door on that part of my life. As we began to grow, we began to have children. I have two children, a girl and a boy, where they're both adults now, obviously. But we raised them largely. My wife raised them Methodist, but we raised them in the Methodist church. I began to develop this habit that you hear a lot, and maybe it's something with, men more than the wives, but going to church occasionally. And I was trying to go to, the Methodist church, trying to really be a part of my family as they participated and really trying to be involved in my own children's formation as Christians. But when I would go to Protestant church, it just didn't click. But I didn't know why. At that point, I was still not thinking. In my 20s, in my early to mid 30s, the Catholic Church never crossed my mind. I had, again, never really thought about that. But I was attending Protestant church, still holding on to that rhythm you and I talked about. It was there, but I didn't know that's what was stirring in me. And I would attend Protestant churches and feel very uncomfortable. The people were very warm. Don't get me wrong. It had nothing to do with that. But something just still did not feel right to me. So I began to not attend church. And you mentioned I did begin to have, I got involved in endurance sports, in my early 40s. and that ended up becoming my church. I was just
absolutely.
training a lot, and it was an attachment that I had that I've recently actually identified in the last 3 or 4 years that I had, that on the surface appeared to be very positive in my life. To some extent it was, but it was yet an attachment that was pulling me away from God. But I have to say, in my 40s, I began to really, I was away from the church for 40 years. So it was a long time, obviously, but I began to really feel drawn to something, and I felt lost, Keith. You on the surface, my career was fantastic. My marriage was and still is fantastic. My children are wonderful, and they still are. But I was as lost as anybody.
Yeah.
And I kept it to myself. I might have talked. I didn't even really talk to my wife. And part of the challenge that I think that we see in some people, and maybe even fallen away Catholics who are trying to make their way back, is we keep it private. And my relationship with Jesus, it was mine, and I never talked about it. Again, another regret that I have is I didn't express, what I was feeling. But I was feeling lost. I retired from state government in 2018, but even before that, I would say 10 years ago, I began to really sit down and seriously trying to figure out what God was trying to tell me. And I was confused. I still, didn't think a lot about the Catholic Church until maybe 10 years ago. And I began to visit the Catholics Come Home website, which was 10 years ago. There wasn't a lot out there on returning Catholics. Podcasts like yours did not exist very much, I think I would say 10 years ago. So I was going to the Catholics Come Home website, and and it had these sections on how do you return, what do you do, connect with a priest, and then I would set that aside for a while, and it might be months before I would think about it again, and then I would go back again, and that happened for several years. And again, God was calling me.
Yeah.
I wasn't a very good listener, obviously, but I wasn't developing this clarity around what exactly I was to do. Again, still trying Protestant, church. My children had gotten older at that point. And my wife wanted nothing more than us to attend church as a family. And here I am out, not doing what I know was the right thing, but I didn't know why it was so difficult for me. And, so that takes me up, to my early 50s. So, I'm 59 now. So that, that was about 10 years ago, I began to think. And my wife recalls me mentioning a time or two, I'd like to maybe go to mass, but nothing ever came from it. And so that's really what ended up leading up to 3 years ago when I really had that strong call. Along that time, I should say, I still felt close to God, still sinning, obviously, in sin. Did not have the gift of reconciliation available because I wasn't thinking about it. And I'd spent 40 years without the Eucharist, which when I think about that now, I could cry of what I missed. But that's what led up to about 3 years ago when I had this serious, overwhelming draw to come back to his church. And I can talk about how that came about.
Yeah. This is a great little place to pause here. I love this. And it is, and I love that moment. It's pretty remarkable in your book. I love it. It's very moving.
Yeah.
And one of those Holy Spirit led kind of things. So we'll do that next. But I wanted to ask you at this point, because you mentioned before raised, and I think still is probably the case in kind of a Catholic minority area of the U.S. I'm curious if any of that baggage, right, became some of your baggage, right? Because you weren't one of these ex-Catholics, I think, who went around, right, dissing the Catholic Church that you were raised with. You had a good experience, you had good memories, you had a good, like, you appreciated that. That was something you were always still drawn to. Did you have to navigate from others, from outside, these kind of misrepresent these misrepresentations of the
Yeah.
Catholic Church, these kind of memes, these tropes. Like, was that out there? Was that around in the Christian communities that you guys are going to church in? Like, was that something you had to contend with at times? I wonder, like, how that was experienced.
Growing up, in a small parish, I don't remember that too much. Though obviously, then and later on, you when people question you, the first question is, "Are Catholics Christian?" And it's like, oh boy, are we? And I'm loving having that conversations today. But then I would say no. But again, like a lot of things, I knew the world around me made it clear I was different in that way when it came to my religion. But I was also a kid who, I grew up in a low income family. And, during the summer, I went to a lot of vacation Bible schools, and I was just hanging out with my friends, it was, and for my mother, who was working a lot, raising 3 kids, it helped her obviously because she knew we were being taken care of in a good environment. So, as a kid, I was going to church with my friends occasionally, even when I was going to mass pretty regularly. And then as I left the church and went off to college and began to, I would tell people I grew up Catholic. You would run into a Catholic and would go, "Oh yeah, I grew up Catholic too." And you could tell it's like we both ran, for this, like you mentioned, you alluded to that earlier.
Yeah.
But I didn't experience, I would say, the way you describe it, as I know some people do, even though I grew up in a very, very small parish. In fact, it was probably what we would call a mission church. So it was connected to a larger parish that was in a nearby town. And so the priest would come, have both parishes. So yeah, that was my experience.
Yeah. And was there, like, as an adult in the Methodist churches, like when you were far from the Catholic Church, but practicing in other kind of Christian communities, I guess eventually kind of checked out of that a little bit too.
Yeah.
But was there ever an air of if you went back, it couldn't be Catholic because this or this?
Yeah, I like you pointed out, I wasn't an ex-Catholic that was out talking bad about the church, but did I have internal baggage? I believe I did. I believe that what I talked about earlier, that growing up Catholic felt so restraining, and the message I felt to families like mine who and I grew up poor, was accept it, and you just need to accept where you are. And it felt a little like resignation to me, as a kid. That was not a word I used, but I would use that now. But having said that, Keith, the church and God they came to us and helped us through those times. I remember our priest coming over and bringing money to help pay power bills and when our power was about to be turned off or something like that. So God provided nonetheless. But that was my experience as a kid.
Yeah. So your moment of return, you mentioned this idea of saying a few times you have back to mass, this kind of this urge, this sense of when you did go to the Protestant church, not quite feeling like things were fitting.
Right.
What became that ultimate drive that brought you back, your first time going back to mass after the long time away?
Yeah. Well, when I was going to Catholics Come Home website and other websites on fallen away Catholics, it was like this secret thing I was doing. I wasn't really talking to my wife. I wasn't sure if God was telling me that was the direction, even though looking back on it now, he was shining a very bright light on the path back home. I just couldn't see it very well. And, before we kind of get into returning, I was, as you pointed out, I was going to the Protestant church and feeling very uncomfortable, feeling a little judged. That was completely me. It was no one else at these Protestant. Like I just felt completely awful, and I just couldn't. It just did not feel right, but I didn't understand why until later. And so about 3 years ago, and this literally came almost out of nowhere on Christmas Eve of 2022. Again, my story feels so ordinary sometimes, but we were having a very ordinary, my wife and I were at home. We had been watching It's a Wonderful Life. We had watched a little bit, paused it, and then it became later in the day, and I just had this urge, like this, it just overcame me that I needed to go to mass. not I want to go to Mass. I felt I needed to go to Mass, and that's, I believe, how I verbalized it to my wife. And so I said, I need to go to Mass tonight, Christmas Eve. And we knew we had a small parish in the town here where we live in Georgia. We looked up on the website, and they happen to have, I think, a 7 or 7:30 p.m. Mass. I want to point out two things at this point. I had not been to Mass since 1987. My wife, who grew up Protestant, had only been to a Mass one time in 1987. And so literally she had basically never been to Mass. So we go to Mass, and Keith, I walk into our small parish, and it looks so much like the parish I grew up in, which made it so much more overwhelming for me. So we decide to go to Mass, and I walk in, and it's a small parish. It looks a lot like the church that I grew up in. Like I just said, I'm talking about windows, pews, but when I enter the church, there's the crucifix, which I had not experienced in so many years, and there's Joseph and Mary, and everything. And I often describe it like when you go to college, and your first several weeks at college, you go away, you don't maybe not come home for 3 or 4 weeks. At least my mom didn't want me coming home for at least 3 or 4 weeks. And then you walk into your bedroom, and like, I'm home. This is my bedroom. These are my things, my poster on the wall. This is my bed, my things around me. That's sort of what I felt like. I just said to myself, I'm home. I'm finally home. And it did not dawn on me until that moment what home meant for me. And I sat down very, very nervous. And of course, I wasn't able to take Holy Communion that night, and I'm all in my own moment, never really then acknowledging that my wife, who grew up Protestant, is attending Mass for basically the first time. So you remember what that was like the first time you're a convert. And so it was very strange for her, but I was so overwhelmed in my own moment being home. I couldn't see anything. It was overwhelming for me. And during the Eucharist, I almost came to tears, and which was so interesting because, growing up Catholic, you don't really know how profound the Eucharist and our Holy Communion is. But God was telling me then, and so that night happened. And when we left, I was pretty clear. And I believe I even maybe talked to my wife that night, I want to come back to the church. And all I asked her to do was maybe attend Mass with me. I said, I know I want to come back. I'm going to set up an appointment to meet the priest. We did that in January and talked for 90 minutes. And I only asked my wife to attend, but she later converted. And the courage, that's part of my story we can talk about too, but the courage that she had, to walk on her own to the Catholic faith. And I went back to RCIA, I did it all with her and was her sponsor. And it's a beautiful part of my journey, seeing her come to the church. So that's what happened Christmas Eve of 2022.
That's remarkable. I love that story very, very much. When I read that in the book, I thought, okay, let's do this. This is great. This is a story we need to share. I think that's so powerful. It feels like certainly a Holy Spirit moment. I mean, you talked about, kind of pausing this movie, right? Halfway through this became the final straw for you to have to return to this, right? But you can see your journey. You can see the foundation being laid, like the Holy Spirit calling you back to the church, right? And the graces of those first sacraments that you experienced, right? That all those years later were there to draw you back, right? I think that's so fascinating. And I think, as you mentioned, amazing for your wife as her first time experiencing these things. I think that's also pretty remarkable. I mean, so you're almost relearning these things alongside her as she learns these things kind of for the first time. I think that's an amazing dynamic as well. So talk for a second about that journey. Because again, this is, I mentioned before in the beginning of the show, Jeff, this is one of those questions that a lot of us become Catholic. Now, my wife became Catholic about a year after I did. similar, like, but different trajectories entirely. I read
Yeah.
for years and years and years, like you kind of did in secret. I was also in secret investigating the Catholic Church and learning, and then sprung that on her, right? And that caused a great big panic in our relationship. But eventually, right, she, more from just meeting great Catholics, some lovely nuns who ran the RCIA in our parish, and some great Steubenville grad who was in charge of faith formation, and a lovely woman and wonderful family. It was meeting people that drew her in, meeting Catholics who were practicing their faith and loved their faith. She didn't need that book learning route that I did, of the hours and hours and thousands of books route. She got that pretty fast. She's a faster learner than I am, and wanted to know, okay, well, where's this happening? Where are the actual Catholics? Where's the? So I'm curious, because you did all that. You guys are in a different situation because you were raised Catholic. You were drawn back to that, but now here's your wife for the first time saying, okay, this is kind of all new to me. How did you guys navigate that? I mean, I think it's beautiful that you guys then do RCA together.
Yeah, and I hope it can happen for others. First of all, there was a couple of things that you mentioned that were happening. The first thing I would point out is I was, and still am in a lot of ways, a beginner. I had to give myself permission to basically be a beginner again, because what I understood about my Catholic faith was what happened, from birth, or from the time I was baptized till 17, 18 years old. Totally different understanding of our Catholic faith that I have now. So I had to really, and this was hard for me because, I had to really give myself permission to start from the beginning. But as you pointed out, the Holy Spirit just came down and just guided me the entire time. It's funny looking back on it now. When I emailed my parish priest, who's still my parish priest, right after that Christmas Eve Mass, we were attending Sunday Mass after that all the way through the beginning of the year. Just attending. I was as happy as I've ever been in my adult life, knowing that God finally called me home, and I was clear enough to see and answer his call. Let's put it that way. And I met with the priest. One of the first questions he asked me was, well, have you ever been divorced? And here I am 40 years away from the Catholic Church, not really understanding why he even asked me that, but it was one of the first things we had to address. And of course, we had not. We had been married 33 years at that point, and we're married, in the Methodist Church. And so he mentions this word, convalidation, which I had never heard before, never heard. So he tries to explain it to me in this first meeting. I heard it differently than what it actually is, but I came home from that meeting with him, and I had a lot of questions, Keith. I had been away from the church for a long time. I had questions about teachings, women's roles and leadership role in the church, like a lot. I had all these questions because I thought about things from a political perspective a lot, and I didn't need to do that, and I don't do that now. But I came home from that meeting with my priest, very excited, full of energy, just, and I talked to my wife about the meeting, and I mentioned, we may have to go through this process called convalidation. And, she got upset about it, because to her, it felt like our marriage was, didn't exist. And, all the thoughts, but we finally ended up talking with our priest. So that was one part of it. The formation or reformation in my case, a few months after that, so I would say as early as March or April of 2023, my wife said, because I told my priest I want to go back through RCIA. I didn't really have to as a Catholic, but 40 years away from the church, I had to, if you know what I mean. Yeah. And my wife said, well, I want to go through it. If you're going to go, I want to go and hear what you're going to hear. I don't want to be left out, Yeah. And I think at that point, she had not even thought about converting. It was so different than she was used to. Yeah. But we began to go through RCIA, studying the catechism as adults, and had a small group. And she was there, and I ended up being her sponsor later on when she finally decided this was the direction she wanted to go. And again, I say this a lot, but to think about the courage she had to take that step so quickly with me is just it's such an important part of my own story in this journey. It's what a blessing. So it was a challenge, I would say, this reformation period that I've been going through for 3 years. And And like you mentioned, you read a lot. I have been doing that nonstop, and a lot of online things. Writing this book was a part of my formation because it required a lot of research. And so that's how that process went. My wife came into the church in 2023. And now we're fully involved in our parish, and I can talk a little bit about parish life. But as I mentioned, I serve at the altar, which is another kind of funny part of my story. And I began serving at the altar 6 months after I returned to the Catholic Church. And I had I was sort of recruited by an adult altar server there who wanted somebody to help give him a break from time to time. And I was like, let's do it. But I was drawn to serve at the altar, not so much to help, which I love to help my parish. I felt this overwhelming desire to be closer to the Eucharist. And I was like on the altar serving with my priest. It was just amazing. And it still is. It's the biggest joy in my life now is being like a little kid again, serving at the altar, just like I did as an altar server growing up.
Yeah.
So I know that was a lot. Like that happened. What I just told you, I know that was a lot to kind of absorb that happened in a very quick period of time during my coming back.
I love that. And I love your, I mean, that is the zeal of the new convert, like what you're describing here, that desire to be close to the altar and the desire for the Eucharist. And that you mentioned that regret, right? That regret of the whatever the years wasted, right? Not being close to that. I mean, that's sad and beautiful, like that you appreciate that so much more now. I think that's great. And I love the beauty, that beautiful, the grace that was given to you guys as a couple to go through this together. I think is amazing, because this obviously isn't always the case, but that's amazing that you guys could both walk through that together. And right, you could reconnect with your faith. She could become Catholic like that. I think that's so beautiful and such an amazing grace you guys were given. There's lots in here, and in your book there's lots of steps and things to go through, and you really walk the person through the journey kind of you went on, and you talk about those the common fears, first of all, of going to Mass for the first time, kind of what to expect. I mean, you mentioned your wife had been to Mass one time. You hadn't been since 1987, I think you said, right? That's a long time. Hairstyles, if nothing else, have changed since then. A lot of parishes, the carpets haven't changed.
I'm old.
I don't think since then.
That's true. Yeah.
But lots else has changed. I'd be curious, like walk us through. So the person out there that hasn't been in a very, very long time, what are the I guess, first of all, what's keeping them back typically in your experience and your research, what you've kind of found when writing this book? And then what should they expect to encounter when they first go back for that first time, if they can make it through the doors?
Well, I'm really glad you brought up fear, because I wanted to talk about that. In my case, I talk a lot about the fear that I had and hesitation. And when I was actually talking to somebody who had converted to Catholicism. So converts, when I mentioned, a lot of reconversion or reverts like me who come back to the church. When I mentioned that a lot of us have fear and hesitation, I don't think a lot of converts understand that, because that enthusiasm is still there. It's like, why would you have any fear about what I'm experiencing now?
Come on, man.
It wasn't, and the fear I had was not fear of the church. The fear that was holding me back was a lot of hesitation. Would I remember the prayers? Would I remember the order of the Mass, which when you're coming into the church for the first time, it's very confusing and very hard to understand. And it feels a lot of rituals. So I had a lot of fear of that and being judged. And quite honestly, Keith, I had some shame that I even left, his church the way that I did, as I began to understand what it is and what I had done. On the list of many regrets I have is that I wasn't a stronger spiritual leader in my family growing up. And I just wasn't. And had I been, I think that the outcome would have been different, not just for me, but my whole family. And as you just mentioned, that 40 years without the sacraments, especially the Eucharist and reconciliation. So, to answer your question, I do think a lot of fallen away Catholics have some hesitation and maybe even some fear. I may be wrong in that, but as I read about this, I think that fear still exists. And again, a lot of the things that reasons that Catholics leave the church, it could be around teachings, it could be a bad experience with an educator, or, of course, the abuse crisis was a big significant factor. Even indirectly, that could still be a factor. A lot of reasons, those are still the same reasons that may keep people away. But I do think there could be this hesitation and fear wrapped around all of that just holds people back. I just could not get to a point where I would make that first step. And I do think that my prayer is that all of the fallen away Catholics out there, and I've read there's an estimated 30 million, if you think about that, wrap your head around that, that they may be right there where I was, maybe praying, maybe on a website like Catholics Come Home, but just can't take that first step. Part of my mission and part of why I wrote this book was to help with that. And so, the first chapter is about me, obviously, and how I grew up Catholic and how I came back. But a majority of that book is like this arc from the first idea to why Catholics leave, and then what you may experience. And I wanted to really help with that. And, I can't be with every fallen away Catholic. I pray for fallen away Catholics almost every day. But the way this book came about, it's become my mission. So there's a lot of reasons, Keith, but I do think fear and hesitation, and maybe just lack of understanding about what the teachings actually are, because you can remember teachings as one way, and then if you've had decades away from the church, you may think something about the church, as we started the conversation with, is just not true and around the teachings. And when you struggle around teaching, I kind of often will give the guidance, don't look at it like you're in disagreement. Just think about it in a way where you need to wait for God to give you the grace to better understand things. And so it doesn't mean you're in disagreement at all. And so don't let that hold you back. If you have a specific memory of a teaching, for example, that bothers you, and maybe I don't want to go back because of that. For example, confession is a lot of what I hear. People go, why do you have to go to a confession? Why can't you confess straight to God, straight to Jesus? And of course, the answer to that is that's how Jesus set up the church. At least that's the way that I kind of understand it in a lot of ways. But don't let that hold you back from making that first step. So I think fear and hesitation, and I think the way we remember teachings and maybe misunderstand those teachings could be a big reason that holds people back.
Yeah. I think this is why you very wisely talk about when you begin to take those steps back towards the church, talk to a priest, get connected to OCIA or RCIA, right?
Yeah.
Some good teaching. You say too, and I think this is fundamental. And this is, again, the difference between myself and my wife and how we became Catholic to begin with is surround yourself with good Catholics who love the faith and are practicing the faith.
Yeah.
There's no better way, I think, than connecting the dots and beginning to understand the faith and then living it, right? This is the model that I think Jesus gave us, right? In the Gospels, right? He invited the apostles in to journey with him, right? And taught them, and then invited and then told them to go kind of and do the same, right? I think that's the model of discipleship that works. And I think for that revert who's been away and might, right, as you say, have these ideas of teachings that they heard, that they remember from 40 years ago that they're not quite clear on. Well, here, meet some Catholics who are practicing the faith, who are living the faith out, and learn alongside them, right?
Yeah.
For those new Catholics who are joining the church, I had the sad experience of the very sleepy parish that is now a very vibrant parish. It's turned 180, and it's beautiful. There's lots happening there now, which gladdens my heart. I can't even begin to describe how happy I am to see this parish thriving, because it's a wonderful community. But it was, when I became Catholic, very, very sleepy, going through the motions kind of liturgy, not a lot happening in terms of faith formation in the parish. and I was at daily mass maybe a month after becoming Catholic. I used to be able to go to daily mass, go to the gym. You'd like that. Then go
Yeah.
to daily mass and then go to work every morning before we had
Yeah.
kids. It was a great routine. And one morning at daily mass, the priest said to me, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here because no one ever comes back. They become Catholic and I never see them ever again." And I thought, like, and he said that to encourage me, but it was so discouraging. I
Yeah.
thought that shouldn't be the case. That sounds so wrong. And I'm glad that you're glad that I'm back, but it shouldn't be the norm that nobody else comes back, right? So I'm glad you point that out. And I think the importance of finding that Catholic community to learn alongside, because the Mass isn't a teaching opportunity in most cases, right? The Mass isn't there to teach you how to be Catholic. The Mass is for nourishing your Catholic faith and for, right, every week that touchstone to renew that. But it and of course the homily is a component to it that can be a teaching part of it. But the primary purpose of the Mass isn't to teach fallen away Catholics how to be Catholic again, right? There needs to be other connections to deepen your love for the Mass, to help you to understand how to live, right? Does that makes sense? I think
It does, and on top of that, the Mass is our highest form of prayer, and that prayer during the Mass has to be united between all of us. And the meeting the first meeting with my priest, I mentioned, you said something to remind me about this. I looked at him and said, if I come back, it's, I'm not concerned about fellowship. I said, it's me and Jesus. Like when I come to Mass, I come for Jesus. He was like, well, I like that, but now I know, I'm in a small parish here in Georgia, Keith, perhaps 100 to 120 people on a given Sunday. But it has become a family of mine, as you point out. When you surround yourself with other faithful Catholics, it's like a family that I've never had before. And I never thought that the fellowship part, the parish life part, would be a part of my journey that I would love so much. But what I know now, back in the days when I was away from the church and away from church, out on a 6-hour bike ride or running or whatever on a Sunday when my family was at church and I'm out, and I used to tell people, well, that my church is out on the bike on my training rides, and I was trying to be my own pope and my own bishop and make the rules. But what we know, and we know this from Jesus, that the unity of the church also means we're together on this, and you cannot, I would say, be the best Catholic you can be without that union with your parishioners, with that parish and with others. And the Mass just does not work individually. It has to be all of us. So it's a beautiful part of me coming back to the church, is me and I'm an introvert. Like when people were coming up to me, because you know how we are, like you see somebody new at church, you'll have 5-10 people come up to you, and I'm very much an introvert. And so when that was happening, I was very, very nervous about it. But God really, and my wife laughs about this now, because I was being asked to attend things very early on, Bible study, adult education. And I was saying yes to everything. And my wife would say, I've never seen you do that. Like, what's going on? I love that part of the Catholic faith and Mass.
And that's an important lesson for those who are involved in the parish life, right? As you are now, that inviting, again, this is part of our story, right? The church I became Catholic in was the closest geographic church to our house. It was very sleepy. My wife went there, and actually she passed out her very first Mass there. She was pregnant with our first child. I mean, we know now that when she's pregnant, she often has fainting spells just because you're standing up and you're sitting down. We know this now. This is the first time it happened. Was in her first experience of Mass at this parish. So that didn't go very well, our very first Mass together, where she passed out. And we were like, oh, this is going really well. This is great. But we then, so I became Catholic, and her kind of thing was, what, I want to learn about this faith, but we got to find a community where I can do this, where we could also be nourished and fed and met. And there are other young Catholic families, and so we did a little bit of looking around, and the next closest church to us was this little tiny, like almost like a mission church, like you described, a very, very small church, busting at the seams with people. And it was busting at the seams with people because it had beautiful liturgy. It had a priest who loved the Eucharist, who loved, right, who loved and knew the faith. And it had this fellowship aspect where, like you say, I went there the first time by myself, and within 5 minutes after Mass ended, I'd met the priest, I'd met the religious sister who ran RCAA, I'd met the music director, I'd met the small group leader, I'd met like the secretary and the parish treasurer, and I met the entire parish staff within 5 minutes. They're all coming up to me, "Oh, hey, you're new. Like I'm so and so, I'm so and so," and that from a parish side now, right? From living out that life and trying to be a giving and vibrant parish that's welcoming people in and loving our Lord in the Eucharist and celebrating Mass reverently and putting Christ central and making others want to know more about him. There's tons of lessons in that kind of approach, right? For us to learn to connect with those fallen away Catholics, those new Catholics also, right? Who are coming at this faith with maybe the baggage of 40 years of being away, or the baggage of I was an anti-Catholic in this denomination over here, and I don't know what's happening here, but I'm curious, right? There's that welcoming environment of giving you chances to say yes to things, right? Is so important, I think.
Yeah, it is. It is. And, I met a lot of people too. And I when you describe what you just went through, that's a beautiful part of our faith. And, and I wanted to touch on confession, reconciliation for a minute. And I know we'll talk more about, I do think that sacrament, as beautiful as it is, could also hold people back. And so part of as you come back to a parish, and, I would just encourage people, even if they have hesitation and some fear, to just take that step. I wish I would have taken it earlier, which is why I'm so vocal about it. But, in my first confession, can you imagine 40 years, a lifetime of sins, it was scary. I was nervous, but I only bring that up, Keith, because I do think that's one additional thing that holds people back before they come back and they become, as you were just talking about, integrated back into that parish life. And the parish life is such a beautiful part of it. And once you're back, and like even with a convert like you, and you begin to understand and experience those sacraments the way that we know now, then you'll wonder why. Like, I ask myself, like, why did you stay away for so long? But the answer to that is I have to operate on God's plan. I can't on His time frame. And the beautiful thing about this and what you mentioned earlier about family being away and maybe our adult children being away from their faith is God's always working in the background, and we just have to continue to pray. But yeah, that's a beautiful story. You coming into your parish and meeting all those people at that one time, very quickly.
I do want to talk about reconciliation, because that's such what's fascinating with that is it is such a beautiful, remarkable thing. Once you recognize it for what it is, right, and regularly go to reconciliation and appreciate that and experience those graces, gosh, it's got to be, and I know it was, right, from being away for 40 years, that's kind of a daunting thing to approach the church and ask for. I mean, even and you go into details, which I think is great, even knowing the prayers to pray, like the act of contrition, right? Right. We have a 10-year-old son who we go once every couple of weeks to a family catechism class, and there's always confession available there from the priest. And even when he's been away for a few months, he says, "Well, Dad, what's that prayer that I pray again? I can't remember that prayer." And that for him as a 10-year-old kid, it's a boundary to confession, because he's nervous. And now that they have it printed there on the confessional every time for him to read, right? And many parishes have that same kind of thing, or pamphlets available, right? Or great books like yours to learn that prayer in, right? But that alone is a boundary sometimes.
It can be.
Prayers to pray, knowing how to go through the motions of reconciliation. Because again, a lot of fallen away Catholics may have gone once. Or twice, right? May have had first communion, first confession, and not come back to the church since then. So they're 40 years away, only did this thing one time, right? So the procedure of that might be foreign. Never mind the actual, the fear of not just how I do it, but like, what's it going to be like? I've been away for 40 years. I've done all these things. I have no idea. I had a lovely priest on the show recently who said that he often got who works at a shrine, Our Lady of Champion shrine in Wisconsin, who said that one of the graces he gets there is Our Lady kind of just leads penitents into confession. They kind of just wander in, and they go, I don't know why I'm here, but I feel like I should be here and tell you my sins.
Yeah.
So he gets a lot of these just kind of, right, these guys who wander into confession to confess sins, right? That's a blissful way of doing it. Many, right, fallen away Catholics will go there with apprehension, not knowing how to do it, and not knowing, right, if they can even ask the church for that, right? They've been gone so long and maybe have a lot of things they need to get off their chest, right?
Yeah. Well, and for me, it was 40 years, and it could be 10, 20, 30, it could be 2 years. Confession, I still think the challenge of it is it's so beautiful. And like you, I want people to really know the gift that we get in reconciliation. But me coming back after 40 years, I had a list, and you alluded to this. I was hesitant to talk about my own confession in my book. Now, obviously, I didn't talk about sins or anything like that, but I did want to talk about what I experienced and how I went through that, because as you point out, I do think it can be a big barrier for returning Catholics. And so I wanted to talk about how, and I didn't really, and you read it, I didn't talk about how easy it was, because it should not be. Reconciliation is a process, and it's healing that we get from God. And speaking out those sins, even out loud to a priest is scary, at first. But once you begin to think about your sins, and now I go much more often than I did in the beginning, because you want to be a better person, you want to work on virtues and that thing. But the first time I went back, it was hard. But when it happened, and I had my phone, and I had my list of sins, and I don't know phone's proper etiquette everywhere, but I think it's okay. Talk with your priest, but you can have your prayers and maybe make a list of your sins and everything you need right there. But, my priest, who's my priest now, was very kind and walked me through every step. And I think that's what I want returning Catholics to know. Yeah. You don't have to know everything. In fact, no, just depend on God to walk with you through the process. And then again, your parish, your new parish family, but your priest knows that if you've been away, you need help, and a priest will walk you through that process. But once I was absolved of my sins and I heard those words for the first time in 40 years, it was such a joy that I had, and I still have great joy when I go to confession. And I try to take advantage. And as the church asks us to go at least once a year, but strongly recommends that we go as often as we can. There's such a joy in knowing that God has given you that grace and the healing that you need through the gift of reconciliation. Next to the Eucharist, those two sacraments are the foundation sacraments for Catholics, and they just mean so much.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, and you do treat this beautifully in the book that you described your experience, and it's beautiful. I think it's really heartwarming is the wrong word. It's encouraging, right?
Yeah,
it's nice. It's good food to chew on for a person who's been away, to read someone else's experience, like as you laid out in the book, and to know what it's like, and how beautiful it can be, and how beautiful that it is. And I think what's one of the first things that, and again, I'm lots of places here I want to go, Jeff, but I've never met a priest, and I'm sure you can say the same thing. I've never met a priest who wouldn't bend over backwards to hear a confession and lead a penitent through a good confession, right? It's one of the great joys of being a priest for a priest who right, to hear confessions and be able to give God's forgiveness. So the priests are dying to hear confessions. Right? It doesn't always feel easy in some parishes because priests don't have a lot of time always for all the different demands, right, in the day. But the priests I know love hearing confessions and are happy to walk through anyone who's been away for any amount of time through confession. And the first thing that the priest will ask you, that you'll say in the confessional when you begin your confession, is how long it's been since your last reconciliation, right? And that gives the priest right away, right? A good, if you used to go in there, Jeff would say, well, 40 years, well, that priest knows he's dealing with a different thing than a person who was there last week or something.
It's like when I said, bless me, Father, for I've sinned. It's been 40 years. When I say that now, it's like a script out of a movie. You only hear things like that. But Keith, you're right. In fact, priests will tell you they are so inspired themselves hearing their parishioners, and when they go through confession with people, they draw great inspiration from confessions themselves, and I think it helps, not only heals us, because I was having this conversation with someone else, but all that trauma then that we carry around, all of those years that I was without reconciliation, I may not have even known it, but I was carrying around like just baggage, all of the sins that I had accumulated all of those years, and to be able to take advantage of this gift and the graces and healing and mercy that God has given us through this sacrament is one of the most amazing things about our church.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. There's one more thing I want to ask you if you had the time, Jeff. I don't want to keep
plenty time.
There's lots to mine in your story, in your book. It's fantastic. I really do love it. And I'll put links in the show notes, and we'll ask you more details about it in a minute. But you have a chapter near the end about, and this is the hardest thing, right? Loving those who are far from the faith still.
Yeah.
Right. And this is the story I mentioned before, the kind of top of the show. This is the story for not just the person who has been away from the faith for a long time and comes back, and then there are still those who didn't come back with you, right? But this is also applies to those converts, right? Who have found this depth and beauty and grace and mercy in the sacraments, in Christ's church, who have deepened their relationship with Jesus in ways that are oftentimes hard to even describe to somebody who's not also, in the midst of that journey. So in both those camps, I think this applies in a certain way. But you give some fantastic advice for people who are in that situation. So maybe mine a bit of that here for us. And there's much more detail in the book, of course.
And it was, and originally that wasn't going to be a chapter. The reason that I included it, Keith, is I hear about it so much. The parish that I'm a member of now, there's not a lot of youth in our parish. There's some, but not a lot. But there's a lot of us that have adult children, maybe adult siblings and family members that were raised Catholic. And you're right. Like, you really want people to come with you. We can't be as fortunate as your previous guest who had 17 of his friends go with him, but we want that. And I should say also, you should expect that when you begin to be more bold about your faith, like I have in a big way, that you'll get some indifference, and that your friends and family may not fully understand. In fact, in my own case, I think that I experience that even now. But it doesn't mean that love is not there. My children, for example, were not raised Catholic. As I pointed out, they were raised Methodist. And I have, I have a younger brother I'm pretty close to who's raised Catholic. And I talk about what I'm experiencing, and everybody knows I've written this book. But I included that chapter because it's on the hearts of so many of us, and we have to treat it with such care that it could be very easily that you could turn people away. I've mentioned this before, and I mentioned this in the book. I think this psychological phenomenon where if you keep recommending something to someone, like, Keith, you've got to read this book. You just got to read this book. And the more you pressure somebody, psychologically, people begin to lose their ability to make their own choice, and they get more resistant to it. So I say that to say that if you're constantly telling people you got to come to Mass, that may not be the direction. But you have to always invite your family, your friends, those, and again, not even people who were raised Catholic, people who you just want to come and come to Mass, to learn, obviously, but to begin to form that relationship with our Lord, Jesus Christ, and to form that personal relationship. We would love it to be through the framework of the Catholic Church, but always invite, but I also follow up when I say that. Be very careful how you respond if somebody tells you they can't come or they don't come. And you have to be very okay with that. And what I've learned is my relationship with the people I love in the moment is more important than one Mass, for example. And so, but that doesn't mean that I won't continue to invite people to Mass. I do that all of the time. And then prayer. Oh my gosh. When I was thinking about this chapter, somebody mentioned to me the story of Saint Monica and her son and how much, and of course, I read very deeply that story, and I mentioned a couple of paragraphs in my book. But the power of prayer, and not only that, but lifting up your family members or your friends, those that you love in Mass, like that's such a powerful way, because we often think that direct way is the only way we can try to get somebody to come to their faith or to Mass or back to Jesus. But prayer, we can't forget that prayer, and God listens, and God is always working in the background. And I'm convinced that no matter what I do, I know that my intentions are seen by God, and He's taking those and making the best out of it. So I would tell people, pray all the time. Pray for your parish, pray for your family, all those that you love that may be away from their faith. Never stop inviting, because when you invite somebody, even if they do feel a little resistant, they know you're thinking about them and they know that you love them. But if they come, then praise God. If they don't, that's okay. Like, you got to maintain that relationship. So those are some of the things that I think about. And I wrote about a few of those in that chapter, as you point out.
And I think, your story, just your story as it is, Jeff.
Your actions, right?
Yeah, it shows us that there's no hope lost for those we're praying for, right? And I mentioned this a few times recently on the show, and many times over the years of doing this, right? But I have Polish Catholic ancestors that somewhere back along the line there, I'm sure were and are in heaven praying for me, right? I never knew them. I never knew that, right? I knew my great grandmother when she had left the Catholic Church with her family, and right, but her ancestors, right, were Catholic, and so were there. So there's you mentioned, right, this rich Irish kind of Catholic background in your side of the family. Right? I'm sure there are people who are praying for us, right? We didn't even know about, in the same way that, as you say, when we're praying for our friends, our family, right, we might not see the effects of those prayers, maybe even in our lifetimes, in some cases, right? But those are doing something, right?
They're always doing something,
right? So I think that, like, your story is a testament to that, right? I think on one hand, and I think again that inviting, I think, is beautiful. Like, I think of people that I've invited, and I love the idea. You invite somebody, they come, and again, you don't always see the fruits of that right away. It's not like we're inviting people who are becoming Catholic the next day, like, oh my goodness, Jeff, this was amazing. Like, sign me up. I'm going to become Catholic like tomorrow, right? That might happen, right? But in many cases, right, that's probably not the first thing that happens. But we don't know the effect that's happened right down the road, or the effect that was the change that was made in them, or the experience that they had in the pew, experience our Lord in the Eucharist, and seeing and being part of that. I've heard countless stories on this show over the years of people who went to a Mass and didn't convert on the spot, but something happened there that caused them to dig deeper. I recently had a friend who I've been praying for a long, long time, right since I became Catholic, who has been to a few Masses and recently just kind of let it slip that he'd been at a cathedral in a town where he was on a business trip. He goes, yeah, I went to daily Mass, and it was peaceful and beautiful. And they kind of kept going, and I went, wait a minute, you went to what? Like, where did you go? Right? And
praise God.
Casually kind of slipped in, and that is somebody that I would never have imagined. Right, I had an experience at Mass when he had come with us a couple of times. It didn't seem like it, but obviously there was an impact there that, well, he went on his own one time then again, and he really was moved by
powerful.
So those are the kind of that inviting, that praying, so powerful. I think the hard part, and I'm sure you know this too, as a father, as a husband, as a person who has friends, family who didn't rush with you into the Catholic Church, right? Is that trusting and waiting, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's easy-ish to say, Lord, I'm praying for this person today, draw them closer to you. It's that much harder to not then go and get that person and drag him into church, right? Just do that
Yeah.
waiting
Yeah.
and hoping and trusting. But I mean, that's the formation of our souls, right? And then there's a whole theology of prayer there, right? But right, God wants us to pray for a reason, right? That's conforming us, that's drawing
So
them in.
powerful.
There's so much happening in there, right? But that is the hard part, right? That praying and trusting that all in God's time. But again, I go back to the idea that your story of a guy who came back 40 years later, right? That is a story that I think needs to be told over and over again, because that's hope, that's fuel for that fire, Jeff. That there is nobody who's no one's more lost than you are, Jeff.
No, no.
That-
And, this is why I love the lost sheep
Yeah.
story, and I feel like, I was the one of the 99 for sure.
Yeah.
But people, you need to expect also to get a little pushback, to get a little questioning, because, God had pulled me so fast and furious back in his church. The way it happened, it was almost like I lost complete control. And how quickly I became involved in parish life and serving at the altar. And then when God called me to write this book, and, a lot of people, may look at me with some hesitation, but my father, who's no longer with us, I loved him very much. And I was telling somebody he could have written a book about clowns, and I would have just been so fascinated with that, not because I necessarily believed in clowns, but I believed in my dad. And I believed that if something was really important to him, like that, there must be something to that. So it's so funny. I was recently telling my wife that when I was sort of growing up through my 20s and 30s, people that were really bold about their faith made me nervous. Like, quite honestly, I was a little hesitant. So I have some memory of the feelings I had when somebody was really bold about their faith. And now I'm obviously that person, and have put a lot of my personal feelings about my return out for public consumption. And I'm happy to do that. But the story of your friend going to cathedral, like kind of on his own, means that, that person was watching others, and perhaps you and others, and what your relationship with Jesus has moved, how it's moved things in your life. And that prayer matters. In fact, prayer may be the single best thing we can do for those we love who are away from faith. But our actions and how we live that daily, we may not do it just for that. We're doing that to serve our Lord, but people still watch us. People see us do simple things, prayer over a meal or anything. And but I thank God every day that he called me back. And I sometimes tell people he kicked me back into his church. So that's what it felt like.
That's fantastic. The book is A Long Way Home. I will put links in the show notes to that book, to stuff that you're doing. Where do you want to point people towards, to the best place to find it, to find more of what you're doing, to follow you? It's awesome stuff, Jeff. I love it.
Yeah.
Where can they go? Where can they find you?
Well, the book was published November 14th, very, very new. And it in the way that this was my first book, and God called me to write this. And so this is what I've done all year long, and was grateful enough to find a publisher that would work with me. But that also put a very tight time frame, because I signed a contract. And so the book was finished in the fall. It was published November 14th and began to go out slowly across the channels. But the book can be found, A Long Way Home, A Catholic Return to Faith, can be found on Amazon, in the UK, in Europe, Barnes and Nobles, all the places where books, can be found. And, I'm working hard. My mission really is centered around fallen away Catholics, so I'll gladly talk with anyone about the Catholic faith and what it's meant for me and what it's meant for my wife. But fallen away Catholics, as I mentioned, there's so many who've left the church for so many different reasons, and we all need to pray that they find their way home. And anything that I can do and get this book in as many hands as I can, I think that's really my goal, and part of why I'm talking with people like you.
That's fantastic. I'll put links to the book and your stuff in the show notes, Jeff. It's great. And thank you for putting your story out there, for being that guy who's telling everybody about the faith, being bold about your faith, because it's great. I love that.
Thank you, Keith.
I want to say God bless you, the work you're doing for the church, and thanks for being here with us today. This has been awesome, and hopefully the first time of many more, because I feel like this is you are a great fit for this channel. You're cordial, you're kind, you're mining the vein of what we want here is bringing people back to the church, encouraging them. I love it. So thank you, and God bless you for the work that you're doing, Jeff. It's great.
God bless you and your family, Keith. Thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Thanks so much.